I'll be interviewing Mr. Clark McKisick from the 23rd Company B.
C.
C?
C Company.
C,
The
23rd.
C Company 23rd.
We've got it wrong. C Company 23rd.
Yes.
And we're in Houston, Texas. I'll just ask you to start. We want to get a little background. So if you could start from the beginning, where'd you grow up? What was it like growing up? Tell us about your family.
I grew up on a farm in northeastern Oklahoma, in the vicinity of Big Cabin, Oklahoma, Vernita, and I graduated from high school in Big Cabin, and a few years later, when the draft started, I was picked as number 35 of the first 50 people from Craig County that was to be drafted. And of course, I was rather small, weighed about 300, and they took me through and gave me a physical, and they said, "Oh, you can't go in, you're overweight and you got high blood pressure." So they sent me back home. 6 months later, they will call me again, and I'll go take another physical. Then they still tell me, "You can't go and be inducted because you're overweight and you got high blood pressure." So finally, the third time, they called me to go in. They were getting desperate, almost to the point that they would feel of your arm and see, well, his blood's pumping through. He'll make a good soldier. So you're now be inducted into the Army. So in a short time, week or so, I was sent to Fort Sill to be processed through to go. And I get to Fort Sill, and I go to get my Army uniforms, and all they've got is a few field jackets and things that are not the Class A uniform that would fit me. Of course, I wear a 38-inch sleeve, and the colonel that's in charge of the clothing issue and store there in Fort Sill says, "Come back to my office in the morning." And I went back, and I was one of the few that had a complete set of uniforms that were tailor-made. I stayed in Fort Sill for 6 weeks while they ordered me all Class A uniforms and shirts, overcoat, and everything. And so I got all my uniforms in. My top coat was about 1 inch short in the sleeves. He says, "You have one of two choices. We can throw this top coat over to the side and order you another one. You stay another 6 weeks. Or you can take it down to PX and give the lady down there 50 cents, and she'll lengthen those sleeves." I says, "Colonel, I've been here long enough. If it's all right, you'll just take and have them fixed, and you could ship me out." The next day or two, they called my name, and I was loaded on a troop train, not knowing where I was going. And I went to Camp Campbell, Kentucky. And there I was assigned to the 12th Armored Division, the 43rd Regiment. At that time, the 12th Armored Division was in regiments and not battalions. And I was in I Company of the 43rd Regiment, which later became C Company of the 23rd when they were changed. And so there was 125 of us that came in at the same time. And we took a crash course of basic training. One lieutenant and I with 125 men, and he did work us. Me, coming off of the farm and not in very good shape, them long haul hikes and double timing everywhere you went were kind of strenuous. And there was times that I had to fall out. But it was then I went into Camp Campbell in January. So needless to say, we had snow and ice all over the streets where we done our marching and training and everything. And about halfway through it, I said, Lieutenant, I says, my boots has holes about bigger than a silver dollar in the bottom of each one of them, both pairs. Well, he says, I'll pick you up Saturday morning. So he come and got me, and we went to the Quartermaster Corps and got me new boots, and I finished my training. And that's where when we were all through our basic training, then we were assigned to the companies as full time. And I took training in driving trucks, and I drove tanks some, but I couldn't be a tank driver because the hatch that you go down in to get in to the driver's compartment of a tank is not big enough for me with a pistol belt, canteen, gas mask, and all that kind of stuff on. If I'm just in my bare uniform, I could squeeze and wiggle and get down in it, so therefore I couldn't be a tank driver. So they finished training me to be a truck driver. So that's then I drove truck then from then on in my tour of duties and service, and we done basic trainings there in Tennessee up and down the Cumberland River, and they built a pontoon bridge across the river. And one of the things that I thought was scary was crossing the river on that pontoons at night with those little blackout lights in front on the back of a tank that I was following right along behind. And you could just barely see a little light on each side of it. You had to watch him to see that he didn't stop in front of you or didn't get away from you where you couldn't see where he went and you wouldn't know where to go. So we finished our basic training there, and then they shipped us, loaded us all up, and shipped us to Camp Barkley in Abilene. So we done training there in Camp Barkley until it come time they said, we're going to load on train and go to New York, and you'll be shipped overseas.
Was the pontoon bridge, was that what you're talking about? Was that part of Tennessee maneuvers?
Yeah, there was.
Did you do any other things during Tennessee maneuvers?
Well, nothing other. See, the truck I hauled or drove was one that was. They put stoves. I think they burnt gas, I believe, gasoline maybe, or some kind of fuel, and they put 3 of them across the front of my truck, and that was where the cooks rode in the truck, and that's where they prepared the food cooked for the for C Company of the 23rd. So I drove that truck and followed along behind the the tanks wherever they went, why, I was not too far away from them at all times, and so I never did. I never done anything other than that, and so I can't remember just exactly how long the maneuvers lasted. Of course, they do them in a battle form. Part of the company is, say, green country or green troops, and the other side part is blue or something like that, you know. And then they were to battle one another and capture, and they had, I can't remember just for sure how, but they would shoot, and you could be supposed to be killed, but you had to fall over and wait for somebody to come by and pick you up, but you wasn't hurt. And
what do you remember about that, the train ride down to Barkley?
That I can't remember a whole lot about, because we were just we're loaded in troop trains, at passenger trains, and all shipped down there, and we had we loaded our tanks, trucks, and all of our stuff on flat cars that were shipped. I can't remember whether they were shipped on the same train or what, but they didn't have a track going in out at Camp Barkley, so the old railroad track that runs between the new the old building that they're going to make the museum in and grace the hotel. You know, there's a track runs right down through there. Well, that's the track that we went in on, and was parked there, and unloaded and took our equipment all then out to Camp Barkley.
What was Camp Barkley like? What did you think about that?
Well, it's not no Sheraton hotel, that was for sure. They were plywood barracks, one story. I don't know whether 6 people lived in one barracks or what. I can't remember just for sure, but at Camp Barkley I was still driving truck, and I would drove for then haul supplies for the supply sergeants of the company, and if I didn't have anything to go or had something to do, why the mess officer would come over and said, McKisick, they need you over in the kitchen to help them over there. Well, I knew if I went over to the kitchen, it was either washing them big old pots and pans or peeling 100 pounds of potatoes. So after so long of going over there and working and getting caught and doing that, they come up with the situation of needing another cook's helper. So that was one of the few times that I volunteered for something, because I was told earlier, you don't volunteer for anything in the Army. But I could see the handwriting that it was easier to be a cook's helper than it was to wash and clean up them big old pots and pans and stuff. And so I worked for a long time in Barkley with the cooks, which were he was on 12 hours and off 24. So that wasn't too bad a duty. And besides that, it saved me from having doing guard duty, and I didn't have to go out and take long marches and hikes and such. And so it turned out pretty good.
So did you make it into Abilene?
I went to Abilene 2 times. Excuse me.
Sorry.
Just at the end of our duty there in Barclay, when we were getting close to time to ship out and go to New York to go to England, why, they give us all vacations, furloughs. And you could go into Abilene, and there was guys that have 4-door cars, and they would haul 5 people in it for $5 apiece. They would haul us from Abilene to the train station depot in Dallas, and living north up the Katy Railroad track into Oklahoma, the big cabin where I lived. Why, I got on the train there and went home. And when I came back after it was at the end of my furlough, I came back down on the train, and there was cars there, guys that had brought men to Dallas to ship out, and they would take us back to bring us back to Abilene for $5. So I made a round trip to from Abilene to Dallas for $10, and I was in Abilene going to Dallas, and Abilene coming back. I was not much of a party goer, and of course, you know, at that time, Abilene was dry. You didn't buy any booze, beer, or anything in Abilene. The guys that wanted such went to Sweetwater, and that's where they'd go to buy their booze and stuff. In fact, Ernie Garneau, that was one of our officers, we was talking about it last night, and he says, well, I went to El Paso down there to get booze for the officers club. And he says, I'd go every month down there and get a load of booze and bring back for the officers to go in the officers club there in Barclay. So it was kind of bad on the drinking parties. And so, but then when we finished our training there in Camp Barclay, out in the dust, mesquite bushes and no big trees or nothing, not a whole lot of anything, why, then we packed all of our bags, duffel bags with our uniforms and clothes and everything, and loaded on troop train again and went to New York City to depart to go, and went to Camp Shanks. And when we left Abilene, they loaded us in this troop train, and but the thing it was, coming back to my tailor-made uniform, with the fact that the supply sergeant had to order me an extra set of uniforms, complete, all dress uniforms, shirts, and extra pair of boots, and all. And I had put them in a bag, and he had to take them with all the supplies that he had to take to go overseas. And so he talked bad about me several times, having to drag my extra uniform around that I never did need. But we left out of Abilene. And of course, I had never been through western Oklahoma and West Texas and Kansas and all up through there. And so we rode the troop train for a day or so. We got to where we could see we was coming into a big town. And of course, coming through rail yards, we was coming by the stockyards, and so we could tell by the aroma in the air that we was coming. We all figured, well, this is Chicago with the big stockyards and everything. So we could kind of guess where we was at. So, but we went on then into Camp Shanks, and we was there 2-3 days before we loaded on to a boat ship to come overseas.
What was Camp Shanks like?
Well, that I can't remember. It was just crowded. It was an old camp and everything. The only good thing about it, I had one of the guys that I'd been in training with, all from Camp Barkley on through. His sister and brother-in-law lived in Brooklyn. Well, he got passes to go into Brooklyn while we were at Camp Shanks, and so he would get 2. And so he took me with him to go see his sister and brother-in-law there in Brooklyn. And it was my first time in a large city, and we come out of the subway right down in close to Times Square in the middle of New York City, and I thought, well, now that's interesting to be to come through here and get a view of New York City. But there was 4 of us that liked to play pinochle. And so we each one got a 50-cent roll of pennies and put them in our pockets, because we figured, well, once we get on that troop ship to come overseas, coming across, why, be nothing to do. And we sat up there on the deck and play pinochle. And you play a penny a point on losing or winning, whatever. So we sat up on the deck of the troop ship and played pinochle all the way across the Atlantic coming into England.
So you were actually on the deck on the way over?
Yeah, you could come up and down. It was, I don't know how many ships that for the 12th Armored Division, but all of us from the 23rd was on the one ship, and they were the ocean was full of ships. As far as you could see, either way to the side of us, you could see little ships out there watching for subs and everything. And so we were pretty well protected, watched over as we was going across. Of course, they zigzagged. They didn't make a straight line across, because if they zigzag, why, it'd be harder for Germans to get a zero in on a ship. And so I think it was something like 13 days to go across the Atlantic.
Did you get sick or anything?
No, that was the thing about it. I had never been on a ship or boat or anything out on water where it was rough or anything, but it didn't bother me a bit. And then we landed in England, and we stayed there quite some time. I don't know, a couple of months or so. And then We drew all new equipment, tanks, trucks, and everything, and loaded them down, and took them and loaded them on LSTs, and went across the channel.
How did your new equipment compare to what you'd been training on?
Well, it was fairly close because we had most of our tanks that we had were of what the latest edition was of them. We got better tanks, bigger and more powerful guns and things after we got into to Germany. But the ones that we drew there in England were just were newer versions of the same thing we trained with.
What about your truck?
It was practically the same thing, and they equipped it with the stoves and all in the back of it, and the canopy of the tarp that goes over the top of it. They make it taller than a regular tarp over a truck that hauls troops in it. So, in order for the height of the stoves and stuff, and so, and then I had a little, not a little, but a 1-ton size two-wheel trailer that I pulled behind the truck. And as I come off the LST, right after all of the tanks had come off, and of course they tear up and make big ruts and such, that I had to fall off of the lip of the ramp off of the LST and down, and I bent the wheel that goes under the tongue of the truck, under the tongue of the trailer as I come off of it, because as I went down into the tracks, why it hooked onto the lip of the ramp off the LST, and I had to pull over to the side and get somebody to cut it off and weld it back on and fix it, and I got the fear then of, them tanks will run off and leave me, and I don't know where in the world they're going, and I'll be sitting here in Le Havre, I believe is where we unloaded, and I'll be sitting here on the sideline not knowing where to go to catch up with them, but they didn't go too far, and I got the truck fixed and caught up with them, and we then stayed in a big chateau and had our Thanksgiving dinner there. Then the front lines was 300 miles into France when we started to catch up with them.
Where did you sleep at night and stuff? Did you stay in the truck?
Well, yes and no. You had sleeping bags, and you had little pup tents, but if it was not too bad, the bows that went up over the top of the truck, you could climb up and on top of them, of their canvas top of over your truck, and sleep in between the bows. Of course, in the supply truck and the kitchen truck, well, I had plenty of blankets stashed away, and so I'd climb up there and have to put a couple of blankets underneath me and a couple over the top and sleep in there. But when we first got to the combat, was really cold, and I'd frostbit one toe. And not bad. It bothered me some even to after I got home. It took a while to get its feeling back, but it got all right. And But and our first combat is where we lost our battalion commander, Montgomery Meigs. Meigs was our commander, and he was very strict with you're supposed to do this and do that, and you stay down inside your tank and look through your little periscope. You don't open the hatch and stand up with your head outside the tank and looking around. But he did. And he got hit with a 88 German shell. It just cut him in two right there. And so you've probably heard of a General Meigs now that's was in Desert Storm, and him and his mother comes to all the reunions for quite a while. Then he was supposed to have been here today, but he has received his 4th star and is going to the Pentagon. So he's a pretty sharp officer. Of course, his father was too, and it was surprising. You see, he never knew his father. His mother was pregnant when Monty Sr. went overseas, and the Monty Meigs that we have now was born after his daddy went overseas, and before and after he got killed, and he never did see him, so he didn't know him. But after we finally got to knowing Monty, and he would come to our reunions and everything, he'd come around us, and all of us that knew Colonel Meigs, he would say, "What was my daddy like?" And of course, he was so strict and GI and everything that we would not really express ourselves to his son as what we really thought of him. But
I'm sorry, can you tell us what you really thought of it?
well, it depends on, him being a commander and rode in a tank all the time. He was around the tankers more than he was around the ones in the supply trucks and such that followed behind him. And so I never had any real severe encounters with him or anything. I had met him, and I was very sure to make a good salute and call him Colonel Sir and such like. And so I thought he was a genuine, real officer. And he just made a mistake, and so that's where he got in trouble. And so
you didn't see that when it happened?
No, I didn't. I didn't see it. It just went back, passed down by the word of mouth to the people in the back. Because you see, they were in really combat against the Germans. Well, the trucks and supplies and stuff was back several miles behind them, and so I know now Herlersheim. There'll be guys that, if you interview some of them, that will talk about the Battle of Herlersheim. Well, now, I've asked some of the guys of our tank crews that were in the battle. And I said, well, how far back were the supply trucks? And he said, well, you would be somewhere in the vicinity of 5 miles away from where we were at when we were fighting the Germans in there. So we were never as far.
Did you ever have a little bit of a scare?
Well, only not too bad. It's but at one time we were all parked, and the Germans had little planes, and they carried small bombs inside the plane. Well, there would be a pilot and someone in there, and they would fly over our camping area and throw out these little bombs, and they would explode, and they were loaded with pieces of steel and stuff like that. And at one time, one landed close enough that I intended to keep that little piece of steel about that big around that hit, and it didn't break the glass completely out of the door of my truck, but it made a place in it to show the size of the piece of steel that hit it. And I was going to keep that, but I don't know, I lost it somewhere or another during my time there on. And so, but the minute we would see them coming, why we'd hit the dirt and crawl underneath the trucks. And so that's where we would get when they'd come over us and throwing those out. And of course, we'd done a lot of moving at night, and at that time I smoked, but when you're out at night following behind the column of tanks and everything, looking at those little blackout lights, you don't light a cigarette. You can strike a match or a lighter, and the little blaze from that is just like a big light that the Germans know right where you're at then, if there's any out, along the road or anything. And so the guy that was riding with me got to chewing tobacco. Well, in fact, he was our first sergeant that rode with me, and he tried to get me to start chewing tobacco. He chewed beech nut chewing tobacco, and he'd take a stick of a double-mint gum and chew in with his chew of tobacco. But that saves you from wanting to light a cigarette. And so the cold weather that winter wasn't too awful bad. We had good coveralls and stuff that were double lined and all that we could wear and keep us warm, and we got hit pretty bad one time and lost several drivers and men, and there was one fellow that he wanted me to come and see if I could get in and out of his tank. He wanted me to change from driving truck to come and drive his tank for him. And I told him, I says, I can't get in and out. I can get down in it. But I says, if it gets hit and I want to get out of it in a hurry, I can't get out. So I stayed and drove my truck all the way through to the very end. And we started into Austria, when the Germans surrendered. And we pulled back, and I have a piece of an OD colored handkerchief. There was 4 of us sitting in a German home, and we was listening to a radio that broadcast the surrender of the Germans and the date and all. And so I had a pen, and I wrote on there the date that was, and the surrender of Germany, and the names of all 4 of us was there together. Dr. Williams wants me to part with that. So I told him, if my kids don't want it, I'll donate it to the museum. And I have several pictures of guys' tanks with them standing up, lined up out in front of their tanks, and I have pictures of me and my first sergeant together in front of my truck and such, that I don't know whether they're going to part with them or not.
Who were some of your good buddies?
Well, the one that Bob Grover was drove a tank all the time, and of course he and I were good friends from way back in Camp Barkley, or from Camp Campbell and everything. And then we, after the war was over with, we had a football team in the 12th Armored Division. Each battalion had a team, and we played one another, each of the battalions. And the 23rd, we came out winners, and so they said, well, you can have a week furlough to down in France, at Nice, down in there. And so we went down there for a week, and then the ones that had over 55 points in the service got to come home after the war was over with. Well, then the ones that had less than 55 were sent home for a 45-day furlough, and then they were going to the Pacific. And but my good buddy first sergeant that rode with me so much during combat and everything, he says, I'll take care of you. He says, we'll unload your truck. And he says, I'll send you out on detached service to haul prisoners. And so therefore I didn't come home and to go to the Pacific. Well, the good and the bad part of it was the guys that came home that was going to go to the Pacific, they came home, and before their 45-day furlough was up, the A-bomb was dropped on Japan, and they surrendered, and these old boys got out. And the ones that, and we stayed, I had stayed there, and they transferred me to the 2nd Armored Division. And I got to the 2nd, and so they was playing football. So I played football with them, and the 2nd Armored Division had been the 1st American Division that occupied half of Berlin. American troops occupied half of Berlin. The Russian troops occupied the other half. And so, but the then they transferred, took the 2nd Armored Division out of Berlin and put the 82nd Airborne in there. And of course the division commander knew the commander of the 82nd Airborne. He said, they're talking and says, why don't you come up to Berlin and we'll play a football game. So and he says, in fact, I'll send 2 or 3 of my old troop planes down there that the 82nd used, paratroopers that they used, that they jumped out of. And so one morning in practice, the coach come by and says, give me a number between 1 and 10. So I don't know, 5 or 6, 7, something or another. He said, you get to go on the plane. And the rest of them had to ride in a truck from where we was at to Berlin. So we went up there and played a football game. And we played in the football field where the 1936 Olympics had been played, where they built a stadium and everything for the 1936 Olympics. So I thought that is kind of unusual to get to play a football game in that stadium.
Did y'all win that one?
Huh?
Did y'all win that one?
No, we didn't win that. The 82nd Airborne had a team that had played together all year, and we had just whooped together kind of a makeshift team, and so we were kind of out of our class, but it was neat to go up there and to be in Berlin and play a football game.
When did you finally get to come home?
45, I think it was. Anyway, we come back down pretty close to Mannheim and stayed in a big camp there, and so that's where we drove all of our tanks, trucks, and everything. From there, we were supposed to come to one of the ports in France. I don't know which one now that we were supposed to go to, but there was supposed to have been an aircraft carrier sitting there waiting for us to come home on, because the 2nd Armored Division was coming home to be a regular army. And of course all of us that had been just transferred into it from the 12th would come home and be discharged. But knowing how the Army operates and everything, somebody got their orders mixed up, and we drove all of our equipment to Marseilles and parked them in a field down there. And we sat there from October to sometime just before the 1st of January, before we finally got a troop ship to come out of there. And so, but we finally got on the ship to come out and from Marseilles, and they came around the next morning after we'd got loaded, and it said, we need a corporal to volunteer to be in charge of 5 men to work in the galley all across the trip home. And I thought, now an old boy likes to eat as well as I do. Working in the galley would be a good place to spend this trip across the ocean. So I volunteered one more time, and that was neat. I had the keys that I could go down to the bottom of the ship in the refrigerator hole, and I ate steak, fresh eggs, all kinds of fruit, and I liked green olives. So I just got me a whole gallon jug of green olives and took them up and set them on the in the kitchen in the galley on the ship, and I had green olives to eat all the way across. But it was kind of scary as we came out of the Rock of Gibraltar. The south winds comes in, and they come up through and go right up through the English Channel, and just the minute we passed through by the Rock of Gibraltar, we hit those winds, and we were going crossways with them, and they'd rock that ship until inside the halls in the ship it has red lights, and when it leans so far, why, that red light blinks off and on. We done that one day, and the captain of the ship turned it south, and we went right into those big wakes, and it'd wear way up there, and pretty soon it'd come over the top, and you could hear it hit the water and shudder and everything. And we went into the wind for about 3 or 4 days, and then turned and went with it, headed into New York then.
What did you do after the war?
I came home and goofed around a little while, spent a little money that I had that accumulated in the time, and in 1947 I was living at home yet, and our neighbor out on the farm was our preacher, and the preacher's daughter was 10 years younger than I was, but I was a good old neighbor boy, and so even though I was older than her, her daddy let me court her. So in 2 years, we got married then in 1947. And I come to Tulsa and went to work for Sears Roebuck and worked 30 years for him. And that's where we still live. We still live in the second home that we bought about 38, 39 years ago.
There was one other thing I wanted to ask you that I forgot. You said you hauled prisoners for a while. I was going to ask you about your experiences with prisoners. Did you have SS troops and German troops? Or?
Yeah, they were German soldiers that had been captured, and I can't remember where and load them in. We took all the stoves and everything out of the truck, so I had a truck with a big high tarp over the top of it, and I can't remember how many soldiers we'd haul in a load, but I think we had seats down each side, and they would sit down there. They may had to stand up in it, I can't remember, but we would haul them from one camp to another one, and so that's what I was doing when the rest of the guys got to come home.
How were they?
The German soldiers, they were very, very good. They was not the ones that were mean and nasty. Were Hitler's SS troops. Now they were wanted to get rid of the American soldiers. They had been trained to annihilate the Americans, and so. But of course, we didn't. I never had no experience with the SS troops at all.
How did as you went on through, how were you treated by the French civilians and then later the Germans?
Well, I think that we was treated basically real good. I mean, other than going into a town that had where there would be German soldiers or such as that, would be the only time that we would be fired on and everything. But the regular civilians that were left at home in the towns were treated as pretty nice. The French, when we first went into France, they just give us a welcome because they knew that we were going to help France finish off the war, because of the French soldiers were in trouble and fighting. They wasn't well enough trained, equipment and everything. But there was some areas where there were French army and soldiers that fought during the combat.
Did you have any other questions? Well, your wife told me she'd be back at 11:30, so we better stop.
What's putting you at that time in it? Germany was a big winery country, and they had a big winery there, and we was caretakers over it, watching it. But they had a big warehouse that had big wooden barrels down each side of it, and these wooden barrels would probably hold 500-600, maybe 1,000 gallons of wine. And all down each barrel had a different flavor, taste of wine. And we had guys that, of course, we were just doing occupation. We wasn't fighting or anything, and so they would take their 5-gallon water can and their canteen cup and go down to this warehouse. Well, it'd start in one end of it, and you'd open the spigot and run a little in your canteen cup, and you'd take a sip of it. Well, I don't know. You're going down to the next barrel. Before you'd get to the end of that barrel, well, it didn't make any difference. It all tastes the same. So they just fill up their can and go on back. And we were in this same area. They made champagne, and we would get so many bottles of champagne issued to our company every day. So we'd have champagne party every night.
So that occupation was tough, wasn't it?
It's tough duty.
Champagne.
Yeah, it was tough duty, that occupation was. So,